Murder at Ashwood Manor. Part 1. The long, winding road to Ashwood Manor cut through the autumn woods like a ribbon of grey stone. Carriages and motor cars alike had travelled it for centuries, though tonight only a single motor car moved along it, crunching over leaves that had already begun to fall. Inside sat Inspector Harold Bennet, a man of 61 with a sharp nose, grey moustache, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had been invited, though summoned might be the better word, by Lord Reginald Ashworth himself. Ashworth was an eccentric but wealthy landowner, known throughout Kent for his collection of rare manuscripts and his peculiar sense of hospitality. Every autumn, he hosted a gathering at Ashwood Manor, bringing together family, old friends, and the occasional outsider to share in his wine, his cigars, and his endless stories of England's glorious past. But this year's invitation had felt different. The letter, written in Lord Ashworth's heavy hand, had spoken of a matter of grave importance that requires your discretion and experience. Bennet, though retired from Scotland Yard for nearly a decade, had agreed. Old habits die hard, and curiosity is a dangerous master. The car turned one final bend, and the manor came into view, a sprawling Georgian house, its many windows glowing faintly with the warmth of lamps inside. The great oaks surrounding it stood like silent sentinels, their branches casting long shadows across the gravel drive. As Bennet stepped from the car, he was met by the butler, an elderly man named Grayson, whose thin frame seemed barely strong enough to carry the silver tray he held. "Inspector Bennet," he said with a bow. "Lord Ashworth is awaiting you in the library. The other guests have already arrived." Bennet removed his coat, handed it over, and followed the butler through the echoing halls of Ashwood. The house smelled faintly of wood polish and old leather, the air heavy with history. Portraits of Ashworth ancestors stared down from the walls, stern-faced men in military dress, women in lace and pearls, all of them keeping their secrets. The library was as magnificent as Bennet remembered, high shelves of books, a great stone fireplace, and velvet curtains drawn against the chill. Lord Ashworth rose from a leather armchair as Bennet entered. "Ah, Harold, my old friend," boomed Ashworth. He was a tall man in his late 70s, his white hair swept back like a mane. Though age had bent his shoulders, his eyes burned with a vigor that had not dimmed. "Reginald," Bennet replied, shaking his hand. "Your letter was intriguing." Ashworth smiled, though his expression carried a shadow. "All in good time. First, you must meet the others." The guests were gathered in the adjoining drawing room, their voices mingling like notes in a discordant tune. Ashworth introduced them one by one: Lady Margaret Ashworth, his younger sister, sharp-tongued and regal, whose jewelry glittered as though she wished to outshine the chandeliers. Dr. Charles Whitmore, the local physician, a man of 50 with thinning hair and a nervous air, forever polishing his spectacles. Eleanor Whitmore, his wife, a quiet woman whose gaze lingered too long on the floor. Captain Henry Lawson, a former military officer, broad-shouldered, with a booming laugh that seemed just a little too forced. Miss Clara Hastings, a young governess with auburn hair and keen eyes, hired recently to tutor Lord Ashworth's granddaughter. Edward Ashworth, the heir, a man in his 30s with a charming smile that never reached his eyes. And finally introduced with almost theatrical flourish was Madame Violetta, a medium and spiritual consultant, whose silken shawl and dramatic gestures drew skeptical glances from half the room. "A strange company," Bennet murmured under his breath. Ashworth chuckled. "That, my dear Inspector, is precisely the point." Dinner was served shortly after. The dining hall of Ashwood was lit by dozens of candles, their flames dancing in the polished silver. Conversation ebbed and flowed, politics, gossip, and the war in Europe that loomed ever closer. Bennet, ever the observer, noticed the undercurrents, Lady Margaret's disdainful remarks toward Edward, the doctor's tense smile whenever his wife spoke, the captain's quick refills of wine. At last, when the plates had been cleared and brandy poured, Ashworth rose from his seat. "My friends," he began, tapping his glass, "I have gathered you here tonight for more than dinner. What I am about to reveal may shock some of you, but it is a truth that must be faced." The room fell silent. Even Madame Violetta ceased her dramatic fanning of herself. Ashworth drew a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I have received a letter. Anonymous. Within it, a threat not only against me, but against this household." A murmur rippled through the guests. "A threat of what nature?" Bennet asked calmly. Ashworth's hand tightened around the letter. "Murder." The word hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor Whitmore gasped softly. Captain Lawson muttered an oath. Ashworth continued, "The writer claims that someone within these very walls harbors a deadly grudge. That before this weekend ends, one among us will be dead." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fireplace. Then Lady Margaret laughed sharply. "Surely this is some grotesque prank. Reginald, you cannot take such nonsense seriously." But Bennet studied Ashworth's face. He was not a man easily rattled. "I take it very seriously," Ashworth said. "And that is why I asked Inspector Bennet to join us. Not as a guest, though he is always welcome, but as a watchful eye." All eyes turned to Bennet. He merely sipped his brandy. "If it is a prank, we shall know soon enough. If it is not, then perhaps my presence will prove useful." The evening ended on a note of unease. Guests retired to their chambers, though laughter and whispers drifted faintly through the halls. Bennet walked the corridors before retiring, noting the locked display cases, the heavy drapes, the faint creak of old floorboards. As he passed one of the upstairs galleries, he paused. A figure stood at the far end, half hidden in shadow. It was Edward Ashworth, the heir, staring intently at one of the portraits. His face, usually so polished with charm, was twisted with something darker. "Striking resemblance, isn't it?" Edward said without turning. "My great-grandfather. They say madness ran in his blood." Bennet studied him quietly. "And do you believe madness runs in yours?" Edward's smile returned, but it was thin, brittle. "Don't we all carry a little madness, Inspector? Some just hide it better than others." Bennet did not reply. But as he finally returned to his chamber, he could not shake the feeling that the weekend at Ashwood Manor had only just begun, and that before it ended, Reginald Ashworth's ominous warning would prove true. The following morning dawned grey and damp, the kind of English autumn day that made even the grand halls of Ashwood Manor feel heavy with gloom. Inspector Bennet awoke early, as was his habit, and spent some time pacing the corridors before breakfast. The house was quiet. Too quiet, he thought. He passed the drawing room, where the fire had burned low to embers. The cards from the previous night's game of whist were still scattered on the table, as though abandoned mid-hand. By 8 o'clock, the household began to stir. Lady Margaret appeared first, sweeping into the breakfast room in a robe of silk, her lips pursed in disapproval at the sight of scrambled eggs. Dr. Whitmore followed, yawning, his spectacles askew. Slowly the others drifted in, some cheerful, some guarded. Only Edward Ashworth was missing. "Not unusual for Edward," Lord Ashworth said with forced cheer. "He rarely sees morning before it's nearly afternoon." Yet Bennet noticed a flicker of unease in the old man's eyes. They were midway through breakfast when a scream shattered the calm. It came from upstairs, sharp, piercing, unmistakably female. Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone leapt up. Bennet was already moving, his long stride carrying him to the grand staircase 2 steps at a time. At the top stood Clara Hastings, the governess, her face pale, her hand clutching the banister for support. "Oh God, it's Edward!" she stammered. The guests rushed after Bennet as he followed Clara to Edward's chamber. The door stood wide open. Inside, the room was in disarray, curtains half drawn, a chair overturned, the faint smell of brandy lingering in the air. And on the bed lay Edward Ashworth. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, his skin already paling. A dark stain spread across the front of his silk dressing gown. At his side lay a small silver knife, its blade glistening with blood. Eleanor Whitmore gasped and clutched her husband's arm. Captain Lawson swore under his breath. Lady Margaret pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth. Lord Ashworth stepped forward, his face ashen. "My son." Bennet knelt beside the body, examining the wound. The blade had pierced just below the rib cage, quick, efficient, fatal. He touched the hilt with a gloved hand, noting the smudges on the polished silver. No fingerprints visible, but that meant little. Everyone stepped back, Bennet said firmly. "This is now a matter of investigation." Lady Margaret's voice trembled with both fear and anger. Surely it was an accident, a quarrel gone too far. Bennet's eyes swept the room. "No, Lady Margaret. This was deliberate." Silence settled like dust. The body was moved to a side chamber, covered with a sheet. Bennet remained in Edward's room, scrutinizing every detail. The overturned chair suggested a struggle, but nothing else was disturbed. On the writing desk lay a half-finished letter, the ink still fresh. He read aloud, "Father, I must speak to you tonight. There are matters concerning the estate that cannot be delayed." The letter ended abruptly, as though Edward had been interrupted. Bennet pocketed it carefully. When he emerged, the others were gathered in the drawing room, their faces etched with fear. "This cannot be coincidence," Bennet said. "The letter your father received warned of murder. Now it has come to pass." All eyes turned to Lord Ashworth. His expression was grim. "Then one of us is a killer." Bennet began his questioning immediately. He started with Clara Hastings, who had discovered the body. "I went to call on Mr. Ashworth to remind him of the morning lesson with Miss Emily," she explained, her voice trembling. "When he didn't answer, I knocked again, then opened the door. And there he was." "You saw no one leaving the room?" Bennet asked. "No one. The corridor was empty. Next was Captain Lawson. He claimed he had been outside for a morning walk, though no one could verify his whereabouts. His boots, however, were suspiciously clean for someone who had been out in the damp grounds. Dr. Whitmore insisted he had been in the breakfast room since dawn, reading the paper. His wife confirmed it, though Bennet noticed the nervous way she twisted her hands in her lap. Lady Margaret declared she had been in her own chamber, preparing herself for the day, though her dismissive tone did little to mask her agitation. And Madame Violetta, ever dramatic, declared she had felt a terrible darkness descend upon the house the night before. "The spirits warned me," she insisted, her bracelets jangling. Bennet listened to each in turn, making no judgments aloud. But he stored every detail away, as he always had. By afternoon, word of Edward's death had spread beyond the walls. The local constable arrived, though he seemed relieved to let Bennet take charge. Servants whispered in the halls, their eyes wide with fear. Bennet returned to Edward's chamber for a more thorough search. Behind the writing desk, tucked into a drawer, he found a small leather-bound ledger. Inside were notes, figures, and lists of transactions. One page in particular caught his attention: loan from Lawson £5,000, unpaid. Bennet raised an eyebrow. So Edward owed the good captain a considerable sum. Motive enough, perhaps, if the debt had turned sour. But the ledger contained more. Several entries hinted at disputes with his aunt, Lady Margaret, over shares in the family estate. Another note mentioned Dr. Whitmore something about prescriptions. The web of motives thickened. That evening, the household gathered again in the dining hall, though the atmosphere was heavy, the laughter gone. Plates were barely touched, conversation stilted. At last, Bennet rose. "I will be plain," he said. "Edward Ashworth was murdered. The killer is among us. I will uncover who, but I ask for your cooperation. If any of you know anything, you must speak now." No one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Then Madame Violetta leaned forward, her dark eyes glittering. "Inspector, the spirits are restless. I can sense the hand that struck Edward down. If you permit, I will hold a séance tonight. The truth will be revealed." Lady Margaret scoffed. "Nonsense." But Bennet studied the faces around the table. Some looked skeptical, others fearful, but none indifferent. A séance, theatrical as it might be, could serve another purpose: to unsettle the guilty, to loosen tongues. "Very well," Bennet said. "Tonight, in the library. We shall let Madame Violetta call upon her spirits. And we shall see who among you trembles." That night, the library was transformed. Candles flickered on the great oak table. Curtains were drawn tight, the fire dimmed to embers. The guests sat in a circle, hands joined reluctantly. Madame Violetta presided at the head, her voice low and chanting. Bennet observed silently, though his eyes never left the faces around him. The medium's voice rose. "Edward Ashworth, if your spirit lingers, give us a sign." A draught stirred the candles, making shadows dance along the walls. Eleanor Whitmore gasped and gripped her husband's hand. Captain Lawson shifted uncomfortably. Lady Margaret rolled her eyes but said nothing. Then, without warning, the great door to the library slammed shut. Several guests cried out. Madame Violetta gave a triumphant cry. "He is here! Edward is among us!" But Bennet was not watching the door. He was watching Clara Hastings, the governess. Her face had gone utterly pale, her eyes fixed not on the door but on the desk where Edward's ledger had been found. When the séance ended in chaos, Bennet lingered behind. He approached Clara quietly. "You knew, didn't you?" he said. She flinched. "Knew what?" "That Edward was keeping records. Debts. Secrets. You've seen that ledger before." Her silence was answer enough. As the guests drifted back to their chambers, Bennet remained in the library, staring into the dying fire. The killer was clever. But not clever enough. For secrets had a way of surfacing, just as surely as blood leaves a stain. And Bennet knew, Edward Ashworth would not be the last death at Ashwood Manor. The night of the séance left the household uneasy. Few slept well. Doors were bolted, candles burned low until morning, and footsteps echoed through the halls long after midnight. Inspector Bennet, however, slept as soundly as ever. Years of police work had hardened him against both real and imagined ghosts. At dawn, a heavy knock roused him. It was Grayson, the butler, his face drawn. "Inspector, it's Lady Margaret. She hasn't come down." The maid went to her chamber. The door was locked from the inside. Bennet was on his feet at once. Together they hurried to Lady Margaret's room on the second floor. A small crowd had gathered already. Dr. Whitmore, pale and anxious, Eleanor, clutching her shawl, Clara Hastings, wringing her hands. "Stand back," Bennet ordered. He tried the door. Locked. He rapped sharply. "Lady Margaret. Are you well?" Silence. With a nod to the butler, he forced the door. It swung open with a groan. The room was dark, curtains drawn. The scent of roses lingered, heavy and cloying. On the bed lay Lady Margaret, motionless, her hand resting on her chest. A half-empty glass stood on the nightstand beside a crystal decanter. Bennet approached swiftly. One glance told him enough. Her lips were tinged faintly blue, her chest still. The physician rushed forward, but Bennet raised a hand. "Don't disturb her, doctor. She's gone." Dr. Whitmore bent reluctantly, sniffed the glass. "Smells of laudanum and strong brandy. Too much of either could kill," Bennet said evenly. Eleanor gasped. "But surely this means she took her own life." Poor Margaret, overcome by grief. Bennet shook his head. "Perhaps. But consider this, the door was locked from the inside. Yet the key is missing. That silenced the room. Dash dash." The second death shook Ashwood Manor to its core. Lord Ashworth himself seemed aged by 10 years in a matter of hours. He shut himself in his study, refusing meals, speaking to no one. The servants moved about like wraiths, their whispers rising and falling in anxious currents. Bennet gathered the guests once more in the drawing room. The mood was grim, faces pale in the firelight. "2 deaths in as many days," Bennet began. "This is no coincidence. The killer grows bolder. Lady Margaret may have appeared to take her own life, but the missing key tells another story. Someone wished to make her death look like suicide. They failed." Captain Lawson slammed a fist on the arm of his chair. "By God, Bennet, we can't sit here and wait for the murderer to strike again. Search the rooms, the luggage, every inch of this house." "And what would we find?" Bennet asked calmly. "The killer has had time to conceal his tools. A search may yield nothing. No, what we need is motive. Why Edward, why Margaret, what tied them together?" He let the silence stretch. Eyes darted, some defiant, some fearful. Dash dash. Later that afternoon, Bennet sought out Clara Hastings. He found her in the schoolroom, tidying papers with shaking hands. "You knew about Edward's ledger," he said. "What else have you seen?" Clara hesitated. I sometimes helped him with correspondence. He trusted me, more than he should have." "In what way?" Her eyes flicked nervously toward the door. "He was reckless, Inspector. He borrowed money, gambling debts, investments gone wrong. He quarreled with Captain Lawson more than once over it. And with Lady Margaret. She wanted him removed from the will. She said he would ruin the estate." Bennet studied her face. "And what did Edward say?" Clara's voice dropped to a whisper. "He said he would never let her win. That he had something, papers, proof that could destroy her reputation. He kept them hidden. But I don't know where. That, Bennett thought, might be worth finding. At dusk, he returned to Lady Margaret's chamber. He searched thoroughly this time drawers, writing desk, vanity. Beneath a false panel in the wardrobe, he found a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. The letters were addressed to Margaret from a man in London, their tone unmistakably intimate. Bennett schemed them, noting dates that stretched back years. Margaret, proud and proper, had been carrying on a secret affair. But there was more. One letter mentioned money, large sums sent quietly, without her brother's knowledge. Bribes, debts, blackmail. If Edward had discovered these letters, he would indeed have had leverage over his aunt. Enough for her to despise him and for someone else to silence them both. That evening, as the household gathered once again in the dining hall, Bennett noted the shifting alliances. Captain Lawson spoke too loudly, as though to drown his own unease. Dr. Whitmore avoided his wife's eyes. Clara sat quietly, observing everyone. Madame Violetta whispered prayers under her breath, her eyes darting dramatically from shadow to shadow. When the meal ended, Bennett lingered by the fireplace with Dr. Whitmore. "You look troubled, Doctor," he said. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles. "This business, it's beyond me. I am but a country physician." "Yet you know more than you admit," Bennett said softly. "You smelled the laudanum in Margaret's glass quickly enough. How did you know it was laudanum, and not some other draught?" The doctor's face reddened. Because I prescribed it? For her nerves. She insisted upon it. And you never mentioned this before. I thought it irrelevant." Bennett's gaze was steady. "On the contrary, Doctor. It is most relevant indeed." That night, Bennett sat alone in the library, piecing the threads together. Edward had enemies, debts owed to Lawson, disputes with Margaret, knowledge of her secrets. Margaret, in turn, had reasons to fear exposure. Now both were dead. But was Margaret's death the work of the same hand, or had someone seized the chance to settle another score under the cover of Edward's murder? The missing key gnawed at him. Locked room mysteries always hid a trick, a string, a duplicate key, a simple sleight of hand. Someone in this house knew exactly how to stage a suicide. As he pondered, the door creaked open. Eleanor Whitmore slipped inside, her face pale in the lamplight. "Inspector," she whispered, "I must speak to you." "Alone?" Bennett gestured for her to sit. Her hands trembled. "It isn't safe here. Charles, my husband, he's hiding something. He had quarrels with Edward, though he denies it. And last night, I heard him moving about, after everyone had gone to bed. He said he was restless, but I fear." Her voice broke. Bennett leaned forward. "Fear what, Mrs. Whitmore?" "That he knows more about these deaths than he will admit. Please, you must be careful." She rose suddenly and hurried out, leaving Bennett with more questions than answers. At midnight, a storm rolled across the countryside, rain lashing the windows, wind howling through the chimneys. Bennett moved through the halls, listening, watching. As he passed the study, he heard voices inside. Lord Ashworth and Captain Lawson. "Can't keep this hidden forever," Lawson growled. "You will hold your tongue," Ashworth snapped. "What Edward knew dies with him." Bennett froze. So Edward had indeed discovered something that touched not only Margaret, but his father as well. The inspector retreated silently. Secrets piled upon secrets. And somewhere among them lay the truth of who had plunged a knife into Edward Ashworth's chest, and who had slipped poison into Lady Margaret's glass. One thing was certain, the killer was not finished. And Bennet would have to act swiftly, before Ashwood Manor claimed a third life. The storm raged through the night, tearing branches from the oaks and rattling the windows of Ashwood Manor. Few inside slept, the fear of another death kept even the bravest awake. Inspector Bennet, however, prowled the halls with the patience of a cat. He knew the killer would not stop, not until cornered. Around 2 in the morning, a muffled cry echoed down the corridor. Bennet was already moving, his cane tapping sharply on the floorboards. He followed the sound to the east wing, to a door half ajar. Inside, a candle sputtered weakly. On the floor lay Eleanor Whitmore. She was not dead but close. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. Beside her was a glass of wine, toppled, crimson soaking into the rug. Bennet lifted it, sniffed. Bitter almonds. Cyanide. He worked quickly, forcing her to retch what little remained in her stomach, calling for the doctor despite his distrust. Charles Whitmore rushed in, his face ashen. Eleanor. My God. She'll live, Bennet said curtly, though barely. Someone intended her to share Edward and Margaret's fate. By dawn, Eleanor was weak but breathing. The household, now gripped by terror, gathered in the library once more. Rain streaked the tall windows, and the fire hissed as logs collapsed into embers. Bennet stood at the head of the great table, his grey eyes sharp. 3 attempts, he said. 2 deaths, 1 survivor. All within 3 days. Do you still doubt, Lord Ashworth, that the murderer is among us? No one answered. Very well. Then we must lay the facts plain. He paced slowly, letting his words fall like stones into still water. Edward Ashworth was killed with a knife. Lady Margaret was poisoned, her death staged as suicide. Eleanor Whitmore was nearly poisoned in the same way. These are not random acts, but deliberate choices. Edward was a man of debts and secrets. Margaret was blackmailed by those secrets. And Eleanor? He paused, his gaze flicking to Dr. Whitmore. Was silenced because she knew too much. Charles Whitmore stiffened. You accuse me. I state the facts, Bennet said coolly. You prescribed laudanum for Lady Margaret. You alone had knowledge of its strength. You were seen wandering after midnight. And your wife feared you. Whitmore's hands trembled. This is absurd. Yes, I quarreled with Edward. He mocked me, threatened to expose certain indiscretions. But I am no murderer. Bennet's gaze swept the circle. And yet, the poison in Eleanor's glass was the same bitter cyanide kept in your surgery, was it not? Gasps rippled through the room. Whitmore's face went deathly pale. How could you know that? Because, Bennet said evenly, I searched your medical bag. And I found a vial missing. Whitmore opened his mouth, closed it again. But Bennet raised a hand. No, doctor. You are guilty of cowardice, of weakness, of lies. But you are not the killer. All eyes widened. Bennet turned slowly, his gaze settling on Clara Hastings, the governess. She sat rigid in her chair, her knuckles white against the armrest. It was you, Bennet said quietly. Her lips parted, but no sound came. You had access to Edward's room. You knew of his ledger, his threats. You were the first to find his body, the first to scream. Too convenient. And when Margaret died, the key to her chamber was missing. Where was it found? From his pocket, Bennet produced a small brass key. In the schoolroom, tucked inside a child's primer. Only you would place it there. Clara's face blanched. That proves nothing. It proves much, Bennet pressed. Edward intended to expose Margaret's affair. You feared the scandal would ruin the Ashworth name, the family you had come to serve, to depend upon. You believed yourself protector, judge, executioner. But Edward would not be silenced by words. So you silenced him by steel. Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. No, you don't understand. And Margaret, Bennet continued, his voice rising, she discovered what you had done. Or you feared she would. So you slipped laudanum into her brandy and locked the door behind you. But again, you made a mistake. The missing key betrayed you. Clara's composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes. And Eleanor, Bennet finished softly, she saw too much at the séance. She recognized your fear. She confided in me. So you tried to poison her as well. The room was utterly silent, save for the crackle of the fire. At last Clara rose, her face pale but her eyes burning with desperate conviction. Yes. Yes, I did it. But you are wrong, Inspector. You think I acted from loyalty to this family. No, I acted because Edward was a vile man. He treated me as a servant, nothing more. He whispered promises he never meant to keep. When I threatened to tell his father, he laughed. He thought himself untouchable. So I made him touchable. She turned, her voice bitter. And Margaret, she was no better. She knew of his games, his debts, and yet she schemed for her own gain. They would have dragged this house into ruin. I ended it. Lord Ashworth rose unsteadily, his cane trembling in his hand. Clara, dear God. Clara's eyes softened, just for a moment. I never meant to harm Eleanor. But she saw too much. I had no choice. Bennet stepped forward, his tone final. There is always a choice. And you chose murder. For a heartbeat, Clara seemed ready to argue. Then her shoulders sagged, her defiance crumbling. She sank back into her chair, silent tears tracing down her cheeks. By the following day, Clara Hastings was taken away by the constable, her fate sealed. The storm passed, leaving Ashwood Manor drenched but quiet once more. In the study, Lord Ashworth stood with Inspector Bennet, his face drawn but composed. You have my gratitude, old friend, he said softly. Though the truth is bitter, it is better than shadows. Bennet inclined his head. The truth always comes, Reginald. Sometimes slowly, sometimes in blood. But it comes. As he left Ashwood Manor, the sun broke weakly through the clouds, casting the first light over the drenched grounds. Bennet drew his coat tighter and lit his pipe. Another case closed. Another set of secrets laid bare. And in the quiet of his heart, he thought, Ashwood Manor would never be the same again.